Back at you.
Good morning. I would like to welcome everyone here to this special meeting of the Board of Estimates. The purpose of this meeting is to receive a briefing from the Department of Finance and BBMR on the proposed budget for fiscal year 2026. The BOE is meeting in a hybrid format, and I ask those present here in the BOE boardroom to please silence your cell phones or other electronic devices. If you're joining via WebEx, please ensure you keep yourself muted. In the interest of keeping this meeting to the time allotted, I will turn over directly to Director Laura Larson, our Budget Director. Madam Director, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Good morning, Mr. President, Mr. Mayor, Mr. Comptroller, members of the Honorable Board. I am Laura Larson. I'm the city's Budget Director. Excited to be before you this morning to provide a comprehensive briefing regarding the fiscal 26 preliminary budget recommendations. I would like to note that today we are joined by the city administrator, the mayor's chief of staff, as well as members of the members and representation from the cabinet across different city agencies. So for the purpose of today's briefing, I'd like to talk through the fiscal 26 budget recommendations going through 5 different topics. I'm going to start by talking about how we balance the fiscal 26 budget, and then talk a little bit in detail about what we're seeing in terms of trends that are happening within various general fund revenue streams, and then talk about some highlights within the general fund budget as we look through the operating budget by each of the pillars, and then talk briefly about some highlights from the city's capital budget, and then wrap up by talking about grants and other funds. So with that, let's just go ahead and dive in. So as we think about the fiscal 26 budget, we have to understand that we don't build our budgets in a vacuum, and that as a local government on the front lines of providing services for our residents, we have to react to what is happening upstream from us. And so right now, what that means is that we have to be prepared to react to what we're seeing both at the state and federal level. So on the federal side, all of us are closely tracking and monitoring what's happening in terms of the uncertainty and the ongoing changes that are happening under the leadership of the new administration. What makes us unique here in Baltimore City is that we're going to see the impacts of that from 2 fronts. We're going to see it in terms of how changes and scaling back to different grant programs flows through to our ability to provide services in agencies like our health department, our Office of Homeless Services, as well as those important capital dollars that support capital investment in our community in terms of our roads and other critical infrastructure. But we're also going to see how a smaller federal government in general impacts our economy here in Maryland. Moody's released a report following some of the announcements of resignations that Maryland is on track to be the number 1 in terms of impacts from these federal layoffs and scaling back in terms of the federal workforce. We know that here in our city, we are home to just over 12,000 federal jobs, but that doesn't count the number of Baltimore City residents who are telecommuting or working remotely for the federal government from their homes in our city. We also know that there are so many other industries in our city and regionally that are dependent upon supporting the work of the federal government, and that as the federal government contracts, those businesses are also going to be forced to contract. So we are closely monitoring what that is going to mean in terms of the general fund revenue that comes into our community. We're prepared to first feel that in terms of income tax, but then we understand that there's going to be additional ripple effects that we may see for the coming years in terms of what that looks like for other major revenue streams like our property tax, investment earnings, et cetera. On the state side, going into this budget, we knew that the state was facing a great deal of their own fiscal uncertainty in terms of how they had to navigate balancing their budget. As they've wrapped up session, we have more clarity now on their plan, and luckily, while there have been pass-through impacts to the city, we're able to manage those, and some of our largest forms of state aid are preserved in the budget that was just passed by the General Assembly. The city is receiving exceeding the max allowed under the income tax disparity program. Our allocation of HUR revenue remains intact, and a number of critical state grant programs like the program Open Space dollars that support our Rec and Parks Department funding is sustained and in some areas enhanced. However, we know that that issue at the state level is fluid, and that they will continue to grapple with those issues, and we need to be prepared to understand what additional pass-through impacts might look like in the future. Next up is the area is looking at how our expenditures are growing, looking back over the last 5 years. So coming out of the pandemic, like many other places, we had to navigate the fact that things just cost more after multiple years of very, very high inflation. What that means for us in the context of fiscal 26 is that two of our biggest operating expenditures are the wages that we pay our people and the benefits that we offer our employees. Those are two of the areas that are growing the fastest. So as we continue to make investments in employee wages, as we continue to offer employees competitive benefit packages, those things come at a cost. And so we have to work to ensure that we can sustain those costs over the long term. And then finally, grappling with how the city adjusts to expiring COVID aid. And that really hits us on two fronts. First, it obviously is the expiration of ARPA funds. Those dollars must be spent down by December of 2026. So that's going to be midway through fiscal 27. But we do know that there are operating costs that have been funded by ARPA that are supporting services and programs that are demonstrating results. And so over the course of the fiscal 26 budget and 27 budget, we're going to have to grapple with how do we deal with those costs once the ARPA funds are gone. The other piece of this is how the city reacts to the FEMA aid that has now been expired and has gone away. With those FEMA dollars, we were investing in the direct provision of services to help us navigate the pandemic. And because of that, some of our services were fundamentally changed. The greatest example of that is how we shelter individuals who are experiencing homelessness. Before the pandemic, those individuals were sheltered in surplus schools in congregate settings. During the pandemic, we had to pivot quickly and move those individuals into non-congregate hotel settings. And now coming out of the pandemic, we have to react to what do we want this model to look like moving forward. But the one thing we do know right now is that new model is probably going to cost us more than what our previous model was happening. And how do we accommodate those costs moving forward? So those are really sort of like these big headwinds that we are navigating as we try to put forth a balanced spending plan and one where we can sustain any sort of investments over the long term. So with that, let's get into the numbers. As we went to balance the fiscal 26 budget, the city was faced with an $85 million budget shortfall. And that was driven by revenue growth of about 5.1% compared to expenditure growth of about 8.7%. So when we look at that expenditure growth, that meant that our expenditures were projected to grow by over $200 million year over year. When we break that down, we can see that almost half of that is coming from wages and benefits. And that's a combination of continuing increases that we have negotiated with our union partners, as well as anticipating increases as part of the negotiations with all of our unions that are currently ongoing, as well as the benefit costs in terms of health insurance for active and retiree employees, as well as pension costs going into fiscal 26. We also know that our debt service costs are going up, and that's based off of the city's plans to issue borrowing this spring as a payback to our capital projects fund. We know that our fleet and building costs are going up. This is driven by the need to continue to increase dollars that we're allocating towards the city's master lease program, and that is an important component to ensuring the necessary daily availability rates to support core city services like our police department, our fire department, and public works. There are a number of adjustments to individual agency budgets that total about $32 million. These items take into account extraordinary inflation that is needed in order to maintain the current levels of service year over year. There's also about $35.4 million worth of other inflationary impacts that have been applied to the budget. And then finally, the pass-through impacts from changes at the state level was about $16 million. As the mayor worked to balance the fiscal 26 budget, we established 5 tenets in order to guide how we would make decisions. So when we were focusing on initiatives that would be part of our balancing strategy, we were focused on items that would be recurring initiatives. Achieving structural budget balance is a foundational piece of being able to achieve the larger financial goals of our community, including providing additional property tax relief for our residents, stepping up our investment in capital budget, and continuing to make additional investments in city employees. We can't do any of that if we don't have a structurally balanced budget. We also were looking for cost optimization. So where could we find a way to make citywide costs more efficient and more effective so that we could avoid having to look into agency budgets in order to find savings? We were also challenging outdated structures. So looking for assumptions that were in the budget or structures that exist in terms of service delivery models or revenue structures that are outdated and out of line with a more modern government, and looking for ways that we could modernize those. Next up, looking at ways that we could ensure that we are investing in quality of life for our residents and businesses. And so how do we focus on the different tools that we have in our toolbox from the budget perspective to deter behaviors that negatively impact the quality of life across our community? And then finally, looking for ways that we can continue to improve and enhance and invest in those core city services that our residents depend on. So with that, our strategies fall into 3 categories of revenue generation, optimizing citywide costs, and then agency savings. What's important to note is when we look at these 3 different options, for every $1 of new revenue that we are proposing to generate, we've identified $2 of savings in this budget plan. The other thing that's important to note is while we have a series of revenue proposals on the table, we do not have any broad-based increases. So there's no broad-based increase to property tax for our residents. There's no broad-based increase to income tax for our residents. And so what I'll do now is I'll break down these 3 categories in a little more detail. So first up, in terms of revenue generation, as I mentioned, this represents about $26.4 million of the budget balancing strategy. This is broken out into 5 different categories, again, that align with those tenets that I was just talking about. So first up, we're proposing to increase the landfill tipping fee. This is a fee that's primarily paid by commercial large haulers. Currently, our fee is $65 a ton. We're proposing to bring that up to $135 a ton, which will generate approximately $8.9 million. Next up is looking at our EMS transport fee. So this is the fee that folks pay when they are transported by one of our city ambulances. We last increased this fee in 2018, and so we are proposing a 20% increase that will generate approximately $5.5 million. This brings our fees in line with what other major metropolitan urban fire departments are charging for their 911 fees. It's also important to note that this will be largely paid by individuals who are privately insured, as the reimbursement that we receive for any sort of Medicaid or Medicare transport would fall in line with the caps for those individual programs. Next up is a broader citywide fine and fee increase. These 2 initiatives are anticipated to generate $6.5 million of additional revenue. The specifics of the increases here are based off of a fee study that is currently underway by my office, where we are breaking down the city's 2,000 plus fees that are on the books and examining them to figure out what is the current cost of providing the services that are associated with that fee, how do we currently collect that fee, and what does our collection rate look like, who pays that fee in terms of a business, a resident, a visitor. What is the benchmarking for that fee? So what does that look like in our surrounding jurisdictions? And what would be recommendations for a revised fee? That study is underway. We have broken that universe of 2,000 fees into 3 different groupings. Our first grouping is about 300 fees that are primarily focused within our fire department, the code enforcement fees that are charged by our housing department, and then right-of-way fees that are charged by our Department of Transportation. The other component of this is looking at fines, and this is where we are going to be looking at different fines that exist and really targeting nuisance behavior that impacts quality of life for our residents and looking at ways that we can adjust those fines. Like fees, a number of our fines haven't been updated for many years, some of which have not been updated since they were put on the books. And so we'll be looking to generate about another $1.5 million from fine increases. Next up is traffic cameras. We're anticipating to generate an additional $3.4 million from the city's traffic camera program. This is going to come from new cameras that have come online in fiscal 25 and will be deployed for all of fiscal 26. This is also going to come from redeploying some of our existing speed cameras to new locations. I want to stress here that that this initiative first and foremost is focused on improving traffic and pedestrian safety for our residents and not identified as a revenue generator. But what we know is that if we deploy these cameras smartly within our community, they do have very real impacts in terms of making our city a safer place. And finally, we are proposing to increase the city's taxi tax from 25 cents a ride to 38 cents a ride. That is anticipated to generate about $1.95 million. This would be the first increase to this tax since it was originally put on the books. Next up, for citywide savings, we're realizing about $43.7 million worth of savings through these initiatives. These items would largely fall under the category of challenging those outdated structures that I was talking about. So first up, there's about $20.9 million worth of savings associated with personnel and benefit adjustments. And what this does is it reflects the final updates and changes to health insurance rates for next year, workers' comp, pension, and then the wage assumptions based off of our ongoing union negotiations. We're also able to save about $3 million on legal fees for outside counsel. This is primarily for outside counsel that's supporting the police department. This is in line with planned spending for the upcoming year. Next up, in terms of agency charges, we were able to find efficiencies in both our telephone charges as well as our hardware and software charges based off of planned spending for next year and being able to leverage some existing fund balance. And those two items collectively will save $2.3 million. We're also proposing to use some one-time funding for one-time costs associated with a number of real estate projects that will generate $11.6 million of savings. And then finally, we've identified a number of legacy items that could be reduced, saving $5.9 million. Next up is agency savings. So as I mentioned, we've generated just under $15 million worth of savings from city agencies. These items would fall under the categories of cost optimization, outdated structures, and investments in core city services. So in the finance department and the information technology department, we're going to be reducing contractual spending and taking a portion of that savings to create permanent city positions in order to take on those duties. That change is estimated to save the city over $1 million annually starting in fiscal 26. The police department is continuing to lean into its civilianization effort. In fiscal 26, we're going to civilianize 3 additional units, allowing us to return 15 sworn positions back to patrol functions and saving a net $1.1 million annually starting next year. In terms of challenging outdated structures, we're removing the remaining funding for the city's police mounted unit that was eliminated in a prior budget, and we're just fully eliminating the program. We're also removing funding for legacy systems that are no longer in use. And then finally, in terms of core city services, we're adjusting the park schedule, the park pool schedule for the upcoming summer to operate pools 6 days a week versus 7. What that's going to allow us to do is it's going to allow us to dedicate one entire day to maintenance at those locations every day versus trying to do that maintenance after hours. What that's going to do is it's going to ensure that we're properly maintaining and investing back in these assets, which is really important following the number of upgrades that we've been able to fund in recent years through the capital program. So with those actions, we wind up with a fiscal 26 preliminary budget of just under $4.68 billion. That's an increase of $478 million year over year, or growth of about 11.4%. When we look specifically at the general fund, we can see that it is up by $256 million, or just under 11%. Our position count is growing from just over 9,900 positions by 166, or a growth rate of 1.7%. So let's talk specifically about what we're seeing in terms of some of the general fund's largest revenues. So as I mentioned, the city's total general fund is about $2.6 billion. Our three largest revenue sources are the city's property tax, income tax, and highway user revenue. First up, for property tax, this represents just over 46% of the total budget in the preliminary spending plan. The total dollar change compared to fiscal 25 is about $58.8 million, or 4.9% growth. As I mentioned, there's no change in the rate here. In fiscal 26, owner-occupied units will pay just over $2 for every $100 of assessed value. All other properties will be assessed at just under $2.25 for every $100 of assessed value. Our projections for fiscal 26 capture the reassessments of Group 1, which is the northern portion of our city and downtown. What we saw based off those reassessments is that property values are growing by about 17.4%. What that looks like in terms of residential versus commercial is residential properties are growing by about 21% compared to commercial properties projected to grow by 11%. When we think about those assessments compared to our surrounding jurisdictions in the state, is that we know that we are at the bottom statewide in terms of how we're growing year over year. So if we look first at residential, we can see that the statewide average was about 21% compared to our 20%. But on the top end of that, the fastest growing counties were growing at closer to 23.4%. That's in Baltimore County, Anne Arundel, Howard, and Frederick counties. Where we're getting dragged down is on the commercial assessments. And so the city's growth was 11% compared to the state average of 16.4%. Those fastest growing counties were closer to 21%. It is worth noting that Group 1 captured the reassessment of downtown, which houses the largest number of commercial properties in terms of their value. So part of this was a little bit expected going into these reassessments. Next up is transfer and recordation taxes, also tied to property. So this revenue represents about 4% of the total general fund. It's projected to grow by $12.7 million, or just under 14% year over year. The rates that are in place for transfer and recordation are consistent in fiscal 26, with 1.5% of the transaction value for transfer and 1% based off of the transaction value for recordation. What we're seeing here is that the average home sale price continues to grow year over year, but overall volume is down. But because the value is growing, even though the volume is going down, the revenue is still increasing. So if we look at the average home sale price from calendar year 23, it was about $253,000. In calendar year 24, that was about $265,000. We've seen additional growth based off of the data that we have experienced through the first quarter of fiscal 25. Next up is income tax, which represents about 19% of total general fund revenue. It's projected to grow by $33.1 million, or growth of about 7.1%. Our rate here is the statewide max at 3.2%. I will note that the state budget that recently passed allowed local jurisdictions to increase their income taxes to 3.3%. We are not proposing that as part of the fiscal 26 spending plan. The other thing that I will note here is that these projections are based off of the revenue growth that that the state was projecting and that we were experiencing through the first half of fiscal 25. We know that the state has downgraded their income tax projection based off of the federal uncertainty that we were discussing earlier. I will just flag that as we finalize the recommendations that you all will be voting on in a couple of weeks, this is likely an area that we will be revising when we come back with our final recommendations. Next up is highway user revenue. In fiscal 26, it represents about 10% of the city's total general fund. It's projected to grow by $37.2 million, or just under 16%. In fiscal 26, the city will receive 12.2% of the statewide collections. This is the fourth of the 5-year increase that the city was able to secure through legislation down in Annapolis. So the 12.2% represents the highest allocation that we would receive as part of that 5-year uptick. We will receive the 12.2% again in fiscal 27, and as the legislation currently stands, then highway user revenue would drop off again starting in fiscal 28. I do want to note that statewide HUR collections are trending down. We see declines in fuel tax and registration fees and are continuing to closely monitor what those trends look like over time. But I do want to note that with this revenue growth, we are dedicating nearly all of it to increase capital spending within the Department of Transportation. The capital budget includes just under $95 million for pay-as-you-go capital to support DOT-related projects. Next up is parking and tourism revenue. This represents about 2% of the city's total general fund. It's actually declining year over year by about $3.3 million, or 6.1%. What's happening here is that you might recall a year ago we had proposed a series of new initiatives associated with parking revenue as part of how we were balancing the fiscal 25 budget. And what we're seeing essentially is that some of those revenue projections are falling short in terms of what we're actually seeing this year. So what we're doing here is we're rebaselining the fiscal 26 budget based off of new trends that we're seeing in terms of parking related revenue and adjusting those assumptions. On the hotel tax side, we continue to see demand increase in our community and the average nightly room rates grow, and we continue to closely monitor that revenue, noting that 40% of the overall hotel tax revenue is dedicated to Visit Baltimore based off of state law. Next up is our traffic camera program. This represents about 1.2% of the city's total general fund budget. As I mentioned, we are increasing revenue assumptions based off of that redeployment. What we're capturing here is annualizing the revenue from newly deployed cameras that have come online in fiscal 25, as well as an additional 6 cameras that will come online in fiscal 26, and then relocating a batch of speed cameras throughout fiscal 26. And finally, investment earnings, which represent about 1% of the city's total general fund. Those are projected to decline by about $17.2 million, or 41%. This is, as you can see with the chart here, this is one of our most volatile general fund revenue streams because it's largely driven by what's happening in those broader market forces. What's happening here in terms of the drop-off was partially anticipated. We are anticipating that as we move through fiscal 26, the city's cash on hand will decline as the city gets those ARPA dollars out on the street, and as we continue to ramp up spending towards that, towards the final ARPA deadline. But the other thing that's happening here is that we know with greater market volatility, these numbers can swing up and they can swing down to zero. And so this is one of the ones that, based off that federal uncertainty, this is where we're going to feel it first in terms of our general fund revenue. So next up, let me switch gears and talk a little bit about the expenditure side. So as I mentioned, the total operating budget is about $3.7 billion. You can see what that looks like in terms of allocations across the city's 5 different pillars. When we break out the operating budget by different funds, we can see that the general fund represents about 67% of the total operating budget, followed by grants that represents about 18% of the budget, and then followed by our enterprise group that represents about 14.5% of the budget. Let's talk for a couple minutes about that 18.2% dedicated to grants. So the fiscal 26 preliminary spending plan includes about $344.4 million from state and federal grants. About $202 million of that is coming from federal awards, and $184 is coming from state grants. This represents a decline of about $16.7 million or 4.6% compared to the fiscal 25 budget. What's happening in the fiscal 26 budget is that we're continuing the practice that we talked about last year, where we are budgeting for grants based off of the recurring grants that we receive and what we know that we're going to receive next year. And so what is reflected in this $344 million are those known grants that the city agencies receive year over year based off of the funding amounts that have been communicated by their funders. What I want to know is that in terms of the federal uncertainty around how they are approaching grants is, to date, we have not been notified that any of our large formula-based operating grants, none of them have been canceled or scaled back. What we know is that it's fluid. And that is what today, we know we have one number, but we know that that number can change on a dime based off of new guidance issued from Washington. So I do just want to flag that this is something that we may have to be prepared to amend the budget as we receive updated information. And that will likely take place after the City Council finalizes the ordinance of estimates by way of budget amendments throughout the year in fiscal 26. Out of that $202 million for federal grants, our 5 largest grants are the Community Development Block Grant, the Ryan White Grant that supports a number of programs in the Health Department, the Head Start Program, the Continuum of Care Program, and the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. In total, these dollars support about 600 city jobs in fiscal 26. So let's talk about each of the pillars, highlighting a number of key investments. So first up is prioritizing our youth. The fiscal 26 preliminary budget for this pillar is about $624.8 million. The general fund share of that is about $531.9, or 22% of the total general fund. In fiscal 26, we're leveraging an investment from the Children and Youth Fund to be able to increase the number of slots that are available for the YouthWorks program. So in summer of 2025, there will be slots available for 8,500 participants, making a $15 hourly rate as part of the program. There's also $2.4 million invested within the Department of Recreation and Parks to cover the operating costs for 2 new rec centers that are being renovated and will come online in fiscal 26. That's Chick Webb and Parkview. In addition to this, there's also a dedicated allotment of $600,000 to support additional programming within the city's rec centers. And finally, we're allocating $850,000 for the Be More for Healthy Babies program that will serve 10,000 families and leverage a 100% Medicaid match. This pillar includes our annual contribution to city schools, which in fiscal 26 is $504.1 million, or an increase of about 5.7% year over year. The slide here is showing you what our local share contribution to schools has looked like going back to fiscal 21. You can see that the blueprint was enacted between fiscal 22 and 23, and during that time, the city's local share has increased by $128.6 million, or just over 48%. The other exciting investment embedded in these numbers is an increase in terms of the city's local contribution for capital projects for the schools, growing to from $19 million to $27 million in fiscal 26. Next up is building public safety. The total all funds budget for this pillar is $1.1 billion. The general fund share is just over $1 billion. And there are about 6,100 positions funded within this pillar. The budget includes funding to invest an additional $1.3 million in the group violence reduction strategy that will allow MONSE to take that effort citywide in fiscal 26. As I mentioned, we're continuing to invest in police civilianization. We believe that this initiative will have a total net savings of $1.1 million in fiscal '26. And finally, in the fire department, we're investing $5.2 million from the opioid restitution fund into EMS services. That will include the 911 nurse triage program, additional population health services, and contracted medic units that can help divert a number of basic life support calls. Next up is Clean and Healthy Communities, which has an all-funds budget of just over $1 billion. The general fund share is about $233.4 million, or about 10% of the total general fund. In fiscal '26, there's $5.2 million invested in the Bureau of Solid Waste, allowing the agency to hire up to 15 additional crews that will allow them to shorten route sizes for trash and recycling routes. It also allows for an investment that is shared between the Department of General Services and DPW to continue making enhancements to solid waste facilities. We're allocating $24.6 million to support services and operations for the city's network of homeless shelters, and we're increasing the annual contribution to BARCS by $500,000 from $1.5 million annually to $2 million annually. Next up, for equitable neighborhood development, the all funds budget is about $346.4 million. The general fund share of that is $213.1 million, which represents 9% of the city's total general fund. The budget includes funding for the Be More Fast initiative, which was recently announced as part of the overhaul to the city's permitting process. In fiscal '26, we'll repurpose an existing PIN within the mayor's office to serve as the permit czar. There's additional funding for the fire department to create positions dedicated to their plan and permit review process, and we'll be transferring the office of the zoning administrator from housing to planning. There's also $1.5 million for the Department of Housing and Community Development to increase their staffing levels to support the city's vacants initiative. This is on top of 13 positions that were created in the '25 budget. And then we're investing $1.3 million to stand up the city's municipal ID program that will be operated by the city's IT department. And finally, responsible stewardship of city resources has an all funds budget of $219.2 million. The general fund share is $185.9 million, or 8% of the total general fund. In fiscal '26, we're focusing in on eliminating the use of contractual services for these back-end administrative tasks. And so specifically in finance and IT, we're going to be converting a number of, creating a number of new positions to take on those duties. And as I mentioned, we believe this will save $1.5 million annually. Next up, we're investing $300,000 within the Office of Equity and Civil Rights to complete the citywide equity analysis and to further inform how the city can implement the equity ordinance. And finally, we're increasing staffing within the law department to expand the in-house affirmative litigation team. Next up, let's talk a little bit about the capital budget. This slide is looking at the general fund backed sources of capital funding going back to fiscal 2006. And what we can see is that when we look at the '26 budget, this is the largest sort of locally backed capital budget that we've seen in our community in the last 20 years. This is made possible by a couple of things. First is that increased HUR allocation I was talking about before. As I mentioned, there's about just under $95 million of additional funding that's going to transportation related capital projects. We're also taking into account a higher GEO borrowing for fiscal '26. So in November, voters gave us the authority to increase annual GEO borrowing from $80 million to $125 million annually. And the fiscal '26 budget will be the first budget with that increased allocation. And then finally, we're investing back $40 million of cash that was received as part of our COVID FEMA reimbursement in order to support capital projects in fiscal '26. As I mentioned, the total capital budget as currently recommended is about $1 billion. Some key highlights, as I mentioned, we're increasing borrowing for city schools to $27.5 million. We also have $3.6 million for improvements to the C.C. Jackson Park. There is $8.1 million invested for HVAC improvements at police district stations. There's $21 million for the first phase of the East Side Transfer Station and $18 million to make capital investments into homeless shelter facilities. And then finally, $5 million for homeownership incentives, an additional $13.2 million for affordable housing, and then finally that $94 million for the transportation-related capital investment. I will note that on that transportation item, that includes full funding of the city's investment in ADA infrastructure as part of the partial consent decree that we've recently entered into. And I will wrap us up by giving just a quick couple updates on a number of other funds. The fiscal 26 budget will be the first budget where we are appropriating funds from the opioid restitution fund as part of the annual budget. For next year's budget, we're recommending $36.7 million that will be allocated to grants, direct city services, and the oversight of those funds. The grants largely represent allocations to individual organizations that were named in settlements as part of the litigation, but there's also funding available for the Restitution Advisory Board to administer a grant-making process for other community-based organizations in fiscal 26. We're providing $15.2 million for the provision of direct city services. This includes those EMS services that I mentioned previously, as well as the creation of the Division of Overdose Prevention in the Health Department and additional funding for the city's homeless shelters. And then finally, that oversight portion is about $450,000. That support the new staff that are responsible for administering contract agreements with nonprofit entities, as well as the office within the mayor's office that is responsible for the executive direction and guidance of those funds. I will also note that a portion of that is available for the Restitution Advisory Board in terms of the stipends that are available for those members. And then finally, our enterprise group, which is our water, wastewater, and stormwater funds, the recommended budget is $636.2 million. This budget captures the rate increases that were approved by the board earlier this year. We can see that those annualized increases are 9% increases for the water and wastewater funds and 3% for the stormwater fund. These dollars will help to support additional positions within the Department of Finance to create a dedicated team to support their enterprise procurements. There's also just under $55 million for pay-as-you-go capital investment back into enterprise infrastructure. And then finally, funding for just under 1,300 positions to support the operations of those funds. And so with that, I will take any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Director Larson. Before opening it up for questions from the board, just a few comments. First off, I want to really thank you for a very thoughtful budget that you've presented, for the process that you've gone through, for being really open and transparent, working with the council, working with the administration. Just appreciate the job that you're doing. I will note a few things that I really appreciate in this budget. One, we know that our workers are critically important, and the investments in our workforce, particularly, the mayor mentioned this in his speech the other night, Director Zaid and I were talking about it this morning, our sanitation workers, our sanitation workforce, absolutely critically important. They deserve everything and more that we're able to give back to them. Also appreciate, I know that we've had some really robust conversations about Be More Fast, about permitting reform, about enabling this renaissance that we know is coming to Baltimore to happen quickly, and to have our young people, our students be part of that workforce, so that we are building our renaissance for Baltimore, by Baltimore. And so to see some of the movement around particularly the fire marshal's office, I think is really, really important. Also appreciate the lifting up of Be More for Healthy Babies. We know that that is one of our city's real pride and joy programs. It receives national recognition, and particularly at this moment where maternal health has finally been recognized as the challenge and opportunity that it is. I just think it's really important that we continue to support programs like that that have brought so much positive recognition to Baltimore and that are saving lives, that there is no doubt in the data that it is highly effective and successful. I know that council members are going to have a number of individual asks around parks and rec centers and infrastructure. I know that public safety will always remain a top priority for us. I will say for me, there's been really good and robust conversation about some of the fines and fees. And I will say that we're in a moment where I think Baltimoreans are feeling extremely high pressure financially. We know that BGE bills have skyrocketed for a lot of people. We know that water bills, taxes, all of these things place a real burden on people living in this city. And so I think it is extremely important that we be sensitive, that we operate with a real scalpel in adding any additional fines and fees to the people of this city. And again, that is something that I look forward to a really robust conversation with you, with the administration, about how we can bring relief to Baltimoreans. The last thing that I will say was really glad to hear the mayor announce some movement on property tax relief. We know that's been an enormous albatross for our city, being non-competitive with the surrounding counties, as well as with, of course, other places, other large municipalities across the country. And so I'm looking forward to a really robust conversation about what that looks like and how we can be aggressive and truly bring relief to Baltimoreans and make us more competitive from a ability to build and grow and invest perspective. And so I'm looking forward to that conversation with your office and with the council and the administration as well. With that, I want to open it to any questions and comments from other board members before I got a few of my own. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President, and as always, thank you for your concern and really for your leadership and dedication to the city of Baltimore. I have a few questions that I want to ask Director Larson, but first, I just wanted to reiterate for everyone that we started this budget process with an $85 million gap, and we know that Baltimore has a history of balancing its budget on the backs of people, and particularly in Baltimore, young people. I know that the comptroller remembers because he was on the city council the last time. I was just a staffer then during a tough budget year during the Great Recession where we saw rec centers close, all PAL centers go away. In fact, we were just recently at, Councilman Glover and I, the groundbreaking for the expansion of one of those that we reopened in Bocheck in East Baltimore. This budget, even with all the insanity in the world right now, does not do that. It expands our services, including 2 new rec centers, continues our investments into schools, does not cut core services, does not raise property or income taxes on our residents. And we want to help everybody understand that even with the proposed revenue, we've identified twice that, like 2 times that in cuts in services. But we have to be mindful of where we are in the world's history right now, in particular. And I know I've talked about this a lot, but even when you think about the fines and fees, as we work through with the council and everyone, as we go through the study about which ones we're going to be looking at, in many cases, you're talking about things that have not been changed at minimum since the comptroller's first term on the city council, if not decades before, that have allowed the city to get behind and outdated with everybody else around us. But we're going to be particularly focusing on things that don't hit the average Baltimorean. And I know I've said this time and time again, but I'll say it again. We will be targeting things like people who are speeding through our neighborhoods, especially those with Virginia tags. We will be targeting people who are legally dumping in our neighborhoods. If you don't want to pay a higher fine for those, don't do it, right? And then there are some other things that we've talked about already, like the landfill. This isn't about the small haulers who are going to Sisson Street or Bowleys or Reisterstown Road. This is about people who are bringing in trucks of stuff into a landfill in Baltimore City. And we know Baltimoreans writ large don't own those things. And we're going to be very responsible about how we go through this and work with this with that keen eye. But as I always say, when I walked out of this building on December the 8th, 2020 to get sworn in, the first thing that I said was that I was going to do the right thing, even when it's unpopular to do. And a time like this, and this leads into my question for the budget director, is what's going to make that hard for everyone in leadership? Because we have this big elephant in the room that we do not know what is the next shoe to drop. As you know, I just showed it to you just late last night. Every mayor, every governor in the country woke up to the reality that the Department of Justice is counseling grants for violence prevention, domestic violence, victim services, just like that, overnight, just like that. And those impacts are before the federal administration actually puts out and passes the federal budget. And we have to all be mindful of what is yet to come and be very careful about what we're all doing collectively. And that leads to my question, Madam Director, for the board in particular, but really for all of Baltimore. Walk us through what, I guess I should say can, and not will, what can happen if we pass our budget in a responsible way that the city always does with the mayor, the council, the comptroller in the allotted time. But later this summer, the federal government passes another budget that significantly cuts aid to the state and the city, both in direct and pass-throughs. What would that mean for us as a city and as a board? What would that mean for our responsibility for our budget in the upcoming fiscal year?
Yeah, great question. So I think this is going to manifest itself in two different ways, and we have to sort of unpack both. So the first is, what does it mean for cuts for direct services that we're providing in the community? So as I mentioned, next year we're projected to receive about $202 million worth of federal grants that are dispersed across different city agency budgets. Most of that funding lives in our housing department, in our health department, in our Office of Homeless Services. What's happening right now under the leadership of the city administrator is that the city's grants management office is going through a comprehensive risk assessment for all of those grants to figure out, based off of the guidance and the direction that we're receiving from Washington, what of those grants we believe has the greatest risk and of being cut or reduced. The other thing that we're trying to do as part of that risk assessment is to understand what we're doing with those dollars. So obviously, if those in the Office of Homeless Services, some of those dollars are going to pay people's rent. And so if the federal government tells us, you know, we're canceling this program today, but we have X number of city residents whose housing we're providing through that program, we have to make a decision about what do we do to support those residents and to keep them in their homes. And so, and obviously that decision is maybe a little bit different for a grant that perhaps is a little bit more discretionary in terms of how the dollars are being deployed. So what we're trying to do is really make sure that we have our arms around where our federal dollars are and sort of what it looks like in terms of the services and the programs that are being supported. The other thing that we're doing, and that I'm happy to report that the city was on top of in January when we received the first OMB guidance, is that we're making sure that all of our grant agencies are staying as current as possible on their drawdowns. It's important to remember that all of these federal grants operate as reimbursable. So the city's fronting the money, and then we submit our invoices and we get paid back. And so what we're trying to do right now is make sure that we're getting paid back as quickly as possible and continuing to do that. But I do think we all have to acknowledge that we don't have a secret source of funding to backfill every program that is supported by these $202 million. And so the best thing that we can do at this point is to sort of be as prepared as we can for this uncertainty, so that as we receive new information, we're able to quickly pivot, and especially for those services that are providing direct daily services to our residents, that we can make sure that we understand how we would navigate any uncertainty there.
And just a follow-up, Director, just thinking about some of the things that we all have heard, and we don't know if these things are going to be real or if they'll pass Congress. But we've heard things like that they want to eliminate Head Start and maybe eliminate CDBG. We know that it would be a deep impact, but can you kind of like quantify what that would look like for housing and other agencies? Just a quick question.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of, I can first quantify it in terms of what that would look like for positions. So, let's say that there was a major disruption to the Ryan White program. That is a huge funding source in the Department of Health. That would mean that funding for 320 positions would be in jeopardy for that department. If we look at the overall funding, federal funding for the health department next year, out of their $184 million budget, the federal funds support $84 million of that. So that would be not quite a 50% reduction immediately, but pretty quickly. What that would mean in our health department as well is that essentially what we would have left after those dramatic cuts would be our business licensing process, our animal services, our school health program, and what we are currently standing up with our opioid restitution funds. And so what I can say is that with all of these programs, the best thing we can be doing right now is to truly have the best understanding possible in terms of the types of services that are being provided, the performance that we're seeing from those services, what other funding sources exist in our community. So, in this case of the health department, a lot of that $84 million is going out to different nonprofit entities or different other partner organizations that are providing these services. We need to have an understanding of what dollars outside of the city look like to support those programs, so that we could understand how we would modify our service delivery to reflect the loss of funding. The other thing that I want to note is that we are entering this time coming from the city's rich tradition of fiscal discipline. And what that means is that we are on track in terms of the status of our reserves. And so if we were faced with a worst case scenario, we are in a situation where we would be able to potentially come back before this board and the city council to discuss how the city could leverage our fiscal discipline and the status of our reserves in order to provide a bridge on some of these things.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. President. I don't mean to start the questions off with doom and gloom, but I thought it was important to talk about that, just because we know that all of us, as we do every year, do the tough work, and we know budget time is hard, right? But we do it in a way that is always respectful and meets the legal requirements and balance the budget as the residents require us to do. But as we go into this year, we just have this huge thing looming over us that I thought was important for us to have out in the open, because it's not Camden or Charm that keeps me up at night. It's this that keeps me up at night. Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Comptroller?
Thank you, Mr. President. Ms. Larson, first of all, I want to thank you for the work, you and your team. And I want you to know that when you say the fiscal discipline that the city has had historically. I want you to know I appreciate the fact that that fiscal discipline usually means you and your office forming a human shield between agency heads and the money to prevent the city from acting in a fiscally irresponsible fashion. So I appreciate the fact that that discipline comes at the cost of your blood, sweat, and tears, and you and your team. A couple just clarifications. I think I got this, but there's $355 million in federal funding just in total in the budget, and 213 million, this is operating and capital together, 213 in state funding. Is any of that state funding a pass-through of federal funds that went to the state, or was that all captured in the federal funding designation?
So some of it may be pass-throughs.
Okay.
I would, my agency partners are going to be much closer to their grants. But one great example, like the Be More for Healthy Babies item that I was mentioning.
Right.
So the health department's budget, we're putting in $850,000 of local dollars. Their budget also includes a corresponding $850,000 in state funds, which is a Medicaid match, which is a pass-through.
Okay.
So the state funds would include some level of pass-through. I can't give you a comprehensive list here today, but that's just one example that's top of mind.
Is that something that you could put
Yes.
together for us?
Yes.
Just so that we can have that number? The mayor just reminded me that the state did mid-year reductions in health last year, and so that's another thing that we have to keep in mind when we're looking at how all of this actually balances together. Just an interesting note, I'm going through the preliminary budget. The increase to the Office of Inspector General it was practically flat. I think it was less than $15,000, less than 1%, which strikes me as below a cost of living, normal cost of living increase. And I'm wondering if there is something going on in their budget that I can't see without the agency detail that would allow them to have paid COLAs for their employees and still have this come out the way it looks on here.
Yeah, so what I will say is that some of those savings would be coming from some of the citywide adjustments
Okay.
that I was talking
Okay.
about, and what that would look like for an individual agency. And like a smaller agency that's very position heavy, like OIG, you might see the impact of some of those citywide items in this way. I'm just peeking through here, the pension, the final pension calculation was a savings of over $23,000 in their budget.
Yeah, because that would do it. Okay.
Yeah, and just the status of the current of their current roster and what it looks like, that looks like it's also kind of
I
fluctuated.
know I'm in year 5, but I still haven't adjusted to trying to make a determination on the budget without the agency detail.
Yes.
And that's not available until the council
Yeah.
gets the budget. Okay, I got you. I noticed that the contribution to the self-insurance fund decreased from $27.4 million to $24.7 million. Roughly how much is in the fund before this coming year's increase?
My colleagues in the Bureau of Accounting and Payroll Services are nearly complete with the fiscal '24 financial statement, and so if possible, I'd like to.
You could send me
I'd
back.
like to check with them on what we're
Sure.
reporting in that
Okay.
number.
We will look for that number.
Yep.
And finally, and I apologize for this in advance because you'd already answered the question in an earlier briefing, but then I've had 2 other conversations with city officials since then with different answers, so I've got to check. How exactly is the relationship working with the Children and Youth Fund's contribution to the Youth Works slots? Because we're going to be providing youth work slots for at least 8,500 kids. Of the money paying for those 8,500 slots, how much of that money is coming from the Children and Youth Fund, and how much is coming separately in this budget from city general funds directly?
Yep.
Not counting the fact that some city general funds go to the Children and Youth Fund before they then get
Yep.
allocated through that process.
Yeah. So in the fiscal 26 budget, there's $13 million for temporary wages to fund all of the youth work slots for young people.
That's in the city budget.
So that's all fund. So now I'll
okay.
break
Gotcha,
that
gotcha,
13 million
okay.
down. So 4.8 million is coming from the Children and Youth Fund, 1.3 from the general fund, 433,000 coming from various special funds. That would include things like the casino fund.
Sure.
2.2 million from federal funds and 1.3 from state funds.
Thank you. Okay, all right. I'm looking forward to sharing that. Okay, so those were the questions. And then the only other thing is not so much a question as much as an observation. And I'm going to address this more to Mr. Mayor because he knows that I do give you credit for a number of the good things that the city does. And one of those has been the dramatic increase in recreation spending over the last term. And I am really, as somebody who has made it one of my key things in my time in office is to try to get the city to reposition more of its spending towards youth development. And I have spent many years complaining about the inequity in the amount of money that we spend on the police department, who seemingly is focused on catching and caging kids when we're not spending even a fraction of that. Well, I guess even a fraction. We're spending a fraction. We're spending a fraction of that on trying to give our kids opportunities, and which is why I am proud to announce that I've looked at the budget and I can see that Recreation and Parks is getting a 9% increase in general funds, and the police department is only getting a 5.1% increase. And even though the actual numbers are still unpleasant, because that 5.1% increase is still $27.7 million more for police in general funds. It's still good to know that we are doing more for our kids in recreation. The observation that I need to make, though, is that as a kid who loved the Dewey's Rec Center, I lived in the Govans Library, and not all kids play in rec centers. And the library is only getting a 4.3% increase in general funds, which is barely enough to cover cost of living. And given that they are just, really kind of getting their arms around unionization, probably isn't even enough to cover the combination of cost of living and catching up with missed back pay. So whatever we can do to figure out how we can spread youth development across the kids in the rec centers and the kids in the libraries, that would be a good thing.
Mr. Mayor?
Now, thank you. First and foremost, thank you, Mr. Comptroller. But also, I was going to say before you said it, that we haven't forgotten about Dewey's. And as we, this is something that Dr. Director Moore and I talk about consistently about as we look down the line for projects for recreation parks, that Dewey's has to be one of them because of where it sits. And as you know, more than anyone, it being the only rec center anywhere near that area. But also that, just to go back to the BPD increase, the overwhelming majority of that is in salary because we negotiated last year. I think that's important to note as well. But we also, Rec and Parks and the libraries have been looking and talking about innovative ways to doing things together. And we look forward to talking with you and the council president and others about that in the future, because we think it's an opportunity to do just what you say, and that's have it all be focused. Whereas I loved playing sports growing up, you didn't love it so much. So we have to make sure that we have that balance, and we look forward to trying to do that as we continue.
Bad experience in softball.
I'll leave that for you to explain.
Mr. Comptroller, I'd like to just correct one number that I had shared on the youth work. So the 13 million was correct, but that general fund number that I cited, that was the increase year over year. So the total general fund is 4.4 million, and that's a $1.3 million increase year over year. And I'll also provide those to your office in an email.
So last year, we only did 3.1 in general. Oh, okay. I was feeling bad because of I know how hard it is for me when I'm trying to listen to you and the mayor's talking in my ear. So I didn't want to do the same thing to you. All right. So if it went up 1.3,
Yes.
then last year it was 3.1 in general funds. Gotcha. Okay. Actually, that's especially good to know, because that also addresses one of the issues that have been raised about the Children and Youth Fund spending money on something that the city had already spent money on. So this is clearly,
stepping it up.
the youth fund is the delta
Yes.
above the city, and the city increased its general fund. So that's great. Okay, thank you.
And one point that just to reiterate with regards to that program, that this summer we are continuing, those participants will continue to receive the $15 minimum wage as well.
Good, thank you.
Yep.
Mr. Mayor?
And Mr. Comptroller, you mentioned the library. That the increase will be covered in this year's fiscal budget.
Yes.
So it won't have to worry about it in the next.
Thank you, Mr. Comptroller. Director Larson, in sort of a broad, crude sense, how much is city government growing in this budget?
It's a broad question.
I know,
yeah.
but I think level setting on all the facts for the board, for the public, for everyone is important.
Yeah, so I think when we look at the general fund in particular and where we are growing initiatives in the general fund, it's really focused in a couple of targeted areas, and that would be continuing and sustaining the investment in solid waste. And so the fiscal 26 budget not only provides funding for those additional crews that will start next year, but we're also taking on the cost of crews that were previously created with ARPA dollars and bringing those positions fully into the general fund. So we're supporting a multi-year increase that has been invested in public works going back to the 24 budget. And that is just the 15 new crews next year alone is $5.2 million. The other area where there's the other couple of areas that I would point to and that are growing would be the housing department. And that takes into account positions that were created in fiscal 25 and will continue into fiscal 26, as well as the additional $1.5 million that's being allocated for housing for those positions in next year's budget as well, to support the new body of work that exists around eradicating vacants. And then the final area that I would point to where there is a targeted investment year over year would be in the space of Monzi, where we are continuing the investment in the GVRS strategy by allocating the additional $1.3 million to those additional positions. Separately, so those are kind of new initiatives or expanded initiatives where services are definitely growing year over year. The other area where we are growing, doing something that we haven't done before, would be the opioid restitution fund. And that is where you see us standing up new types of programs and services as part of the city's response to the opioid epidemic. So, you know, the Board of Estimates and the City Council approved a supplemental to this year's budget. As I mentioned, we're recommending to spend about $36 million of additional funding next year. That's mainly going into either grants or city programs that we're seeing, you know, the largest investment obviously being within the health department and that new division that's being created.
Understood. So just year over year, last year's budget to this year's budget, how much are we growing in the general operating fund?
So the operating budget is growing by 5.8%, and the city's capital budget is growing by 37%. So, you know, the operating spending plan, that's sort of with that 5.8% growth is sort of in that ballpark of that normal growth that we expect year over year. And then the 37% increase on the capital fund is being largely driven by those increases in those locally backed sources that we talked about when it comes to capital spending.
Appreciate that. Capital was going to be my next question, so thanks for answering it.
Yeah.
Tacking back to sort of what the mayor was most concerned about, and something that I think everyone on this board is also deeply concerned about, sort of the crisis scenario where the president, the Congress, makes deep cuts into, I think he mentioned Head Start as one possibility. We know that, you know, Maryland and Baltimore in particular is very reliant on Medicaid, and that is clearly something that both folks in the Republican Congress and the president's team are interested in. So in these kind of doomsday scenarios where our economy is badly hurt, I'm just curious, how much do we have in our rainy day fund? And what would be the consequences of the potential consequences of drawing down from our rainy day fund?
So the rainy day fund this board has established policies of the appropriate use in terms of when we draw from the rainy day fund, and then what the repayment requirements are against the rainy day fund. As I mentioned, we're continuing to work towards finalizing the fiscal 26 financial statements. When we looked at the 23 the fiscal 2023 rainy day fund, it was $167.7 million. Which puts us just slightly under our 8% target for that fund. When we look at what we returned to fund balance this year as part of the fiscal 26 closeout, the rainy day fund is continuing at that about $170 million. And then we were able to assign about another $255 million towards different risk areas as we go into the upcoming budget.
And again, just if you could articulate just what if it were to start raining in Baltimore, and that rain were to be coming largely from choices that the President of the United States and the United States Congress make, what would the consequence if we were to draw down on that rainy day fund be in terms of bond rating or any other potential consequences for the city?
So the first thing is we would have to make sure that the event qualifies for utilizing rainy day funds. And so that would be dependent upon sort of I would have to go study the policy to see if a cancellation of a federal grant would fall under one of the allowable uses. The other thing is, we'd only be able to utilize it as a temporary source of funding to sustain that program. And then we'd have to be prepared to pay back the rainy day window within the repayment timeline. And forgive me, I don't know the exact, it's between 3 to 5 years. And I'd be happy to point to the policy, the admin rule that we currently have that governs the fund. So it certainly exists as as a potential. What I will say is, if we look back to the past 10 years and all of the crisis situations that we've navigated as an organization going back 10 years, we've been able to largely avoid having to go to the rainy day fund as the source to fund it, because again, we want to maintain those reserves at that level, just as sort of a best practice. The other thing that we have to think about when it comes to how we want to approach our reserves for these types of crisis situations is what it does to our bond rating. So you heard me, I think anybody who has talked to me in my 2.5 years as your budget director, I will spend hours talking to you about how I believe that the city needs to spend dramatically more money on the capital budget. I believe with all of my heart that is the number one liability facing all of us in this organization, is the deferred maintenance backlog and the risk associated with not making significant strides in digging out of that. So, but what we're doing with our geo borrowing by going from 80 to 125 is our first step of a multi-step strategy to get to 200 million, which essentially would get us to a more appropriate place for everything without transportation. We would still have to solve for a solution there. So as we try to get to 200 million, we've been coordinating with our debt consultants to talk about how do we do that in a way that we maintain our bond rating and that we don't go backwards. Because if we go backwards on our bond rating, it's going to get harder to get to 200 million because it's going to be more expensive. And then we get further away from our goal of being able to make meaningful investments back into our capital. Tying that back to the rainy day, when we get rated by the bond rating agencies, they have this scorecard that they use. And it captures a variety of conditions, some that are within our control and some that are not within our control. The one that is mostly in our control is the status of our reserves and our sort of fiscal, like our fiscal health rating agencies. In the most recent Moody's report, we were outperforming our AA bond rating for those items. We were performing at a AAA. But for the other categories that are not in our control, which would be the demographics of our community in terms of income and things like that, we are underperforming our AA. So what I would be concerned about as we look to dip into the reserves is I think we just have to toggle that because if we go backwards on that one thing that we control, I think it puts us, it makes it harder to get to where we need to go with capital, and it sort of opens up these other unintended consequences that might be very expensive for us to deal with.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that explanation. And I wanted to ask that question because I think, when the public thinks about, well, what are some of the options, it comes up,
Yep.
the rainy day fund. And I want folks to know that there are consequences. It is not just like a piggy bank account that we
Yeah.
can put money in, take money out, in that, to your point about our bond rating, it's fragile, and our ability to borrow and invest is critically important, as you talked about with capital. Along those lines, and again, I know there's no magic wand here, but I was down at the port the other day talking to some industry leaders over there who were really concerned about the tariffs and the impact that, particularly for our export, import, and the amount of manufacturing that we, the city of Baltimore, and just really this region are doing. Can you talk at all? And again, it's extremely volatile. It may be reciprocal tariffs one day, it may be 125% on China the next day, who knows? But could you talk about, just from the city's budget perspective, the impact that the tariffs are predicted to have on our finances?
Yeah. And before I dive into that, I just want to sort of circle back and confirm on the rainy day fund, we have to pay back those funds within 5 years of drawing them down. In terms of the tariff item, we are going to see the impact of that first in terms of our capital program and our equipment costs and the cost of supporting our enterprise funds. Those are the places where it's going to hit us the hardest and it's going to hit us the quickest. What is incredibly unfortunate about all of the timing of this is that we were just finally starting to recover. We had gotten behind during the pandemic when all that stuff was piling on, and we've done we've done things in the past couple of years in terms of increasing the master lease funding, in terms of stabilizing what's happening at the water and the wastewater facilities. And so this is just another sort of blow that we're going to have to deal with, like, once we are just sort of getting back on equal footing. So the things that I think we need to be prepared for is the purchasing power of our master lease program coming down for fiscal 26. We increased that number to $35 million in the fiscal 24 budget. I want to say that that's just shy of $40 million in the fiscal 26 budget. And what that's going to mean is that Director Attila and his team are going to be able to buy fewer assets. And so that's challenging when we're trying to decide how many ambulances do we buy versus how many solid waste load packers do we buy? We're probably just going to buy less. That's what's going to have to happen. In terms of our capital program, what the problem here is that where we have projects that are underway, where we have shovels in the ground, where we're contracts in place, what's going to happen is the contractors who are doing that work for us are going to come back to us with change orders and say, we have to pass on this X percentage increase in these materials, and then we're going, our capital budget team from planning and our capital teams within the agencies are going to have to look at how they rob Peter to pay Paul to get projects that are where we have shovels in the ground to get them across the finish line. So those are going to be the things that we see in 26. Because of timing, we haven't recalibrated any of those things to account for increases. And so what I really think is that we're going to really have to grapple with that. In 26, we're just going to have to accept the fact that we have less purchasing power, and we're going to have to sort of grapple with that in terms of what it looks like going into the 27 budget.
Yeah, and before going to the mayor, I would assume that part of what I heard when I was down at the port is it also may have a real impact on wages and on workers, because many of our major industry partners are reliant on global trade. And so to just shift toward attempting to manufacture everything locally is just not a realistic proposition for, I think, most people. While it's a nice goal, so much of the way our economy is structured is based on us being able to import things at a certain price. And so I heard a lot of insecurity among businesses down there that said, this may either put us out of business or cause us to have to lay folks off. I assume plenty of which are Baltimoreans, because when tariffs or these additional taxes go on, we're not going to be able to afford to manufacture those big cranes. We're not going to be able to afford to get the cost of materials that we badly need for many of our businesses down there. And I think that is probably not just a Port of Maryland problem. That is a large-scale problem for many of our businesses that rely on products to be at a certain cost. I'm going to go to Mr. Mayor before I continue on this line.
Yeah, just a follow up here. I think on this great line of question and your great responses. I think in addition to we know costs rising for projects, whether it be rec centers or schools or what have you, that water projects that we have and we've already seen. I think it's important to note and ask that we're probably likely also to again see supply chain delays and then cost increases, not just for physical things, but for like medicine and things that we have on EMS vehicles. All of those kind of things are probably likely to rise as well, if I'm correct.
Yeah, and I mean, definitely, we're finally starting to see relief. Like as I was mentioning, we were finally starting to see relief, and we're going to see that go back in the other direction. I think, in terms of what this looks like for jobs regionally, it's going to be a double whammy in terms of how we started this conversation, talking about having to prepare for job loss coming from public sector jobs. So in preparation for today's hearing, I was just studying some of the unemployment data coming from the State Department of Labor. And so they, when we look at their March jobs, the public sector, we lost 3,500 public sector jobs, but we added 2,300 private industry jobs. And so one of the things that was—
Real quick, it said, as the mayor and I were talking about this, those 3,500 that you mentioned, were those jobs cut? Are those federal government jobs? Are those jobs that were when there's been all these layoffs with the NIH, with the Department of Education, with USAID, all the state departments coming next? Is that those jobs? Just trying to understand.
This was the data that the State Department of Labor published on April 18th, looking back to March. And so the state lost 3,500 public sector jobs. 2,700 of those were federal government jobs. One of the things to note is that this is the beginning. We know that there's a lot more in this because that doesn't pick up anybody who's on administrative leave, and it doesn't pick up anybody who's taken the voluntary severance agreements that's still in separation status. And so this number is going to grow over time as additional actions happen in Washington. But that the March jobs report shows that we were still picking up in federal sector jobs across different industries. And so if these tariffs end up having the impacts that you're talking about, what's going to happen is we're going to see loss on both sides of the ledger, which is going to flow through to us sooner rather than later, because just in terms of how the state income tax allocation works. The way that it works is that the state collects all of the local income tax revenue. They use a formula to allocate it back to us. If the state has less money statewide, regardless of the number of jobs here in Baltimore, we're going to get less money because the pie is less. So these are things that we are, closely monitoring. I think in the executive summary publication that we will be publishing on May 7th as part of our Board of Estimates recommendations, we've outlined an economic outlook trying to describe some of these things because it's really sort of a dance of, we know that these things are coming, but a lot of the data reports that we would use to really understand the magnitude are backwards looking. And so we're trying to kind of put together what are some of the forward-looking, more real-time indicators that we can point to that would help us to understand what's on the horizon.
I assume we don't, but the 2,700 jobs that you mentioned, do we know how many of those are from Baltimore? You said those are state. Do we have any indication? I'm just trying to figure out how many Baltimoreans. We've talked about close to 11,000 or so federal workers that live in our city. Just trying to understand, and you made this point really clearly that we're not done seeing it in terms of the impacts. And the mayor and I were having a similar conversation about this, but just trying to understand if we have any sense of like how many jobs we've lost so far versus how many more are coming.
This data, because I think it's being flowed through from the federal report that's generated by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, we're not able to disaggregate it down to the city level. What we can do is we can lean into the partnership that we have with the state comptroller Lehrman and her staff to understand, because they have access to more disaggregated data that could maybe help us to understand what's happening at a very granular level. So that's, we've been able to lean into that partnership on a number of projects, and so that this is one that we can follow up with her on. In terms of the jobs, the federal jobs locally, the 12,000 job number that gets tossed around, that's the federal jobs that are located here in the city.
Right.
It doesn't account for your neighbor who lives in this, or my neighbor who lives in the city but drives to a federal office outside of the city. Mm-hmm. That's not being captured in that universe of 12,000. So it's a number larger than that, but we're not able to get at how many people live here but travel out of the city to go to their federal job.
Understood. And it also doesn't capture contractors or any of the auxiliary industries that are impacted as well. So to Mr. Comptroller's point earlier, do want to appreciate the increased support, under this administration for our young people. Mm-hmm. Folks will know I taught in West Baltimore, and it was a real recreational opportunity desert. There was a boxing gym not too far from the school I taught in, but other than that, it was pretty lacking. And so seeing the investments made by this administration is really heartening. And I do want to appreciate it. This is absolutely something that when we three were on council, I think we talked about a lot, was the need to shift toward a more youth-centered city. And so seeing those investments made is really good. We'll also agree with the comptroller, big advocate for Enoch Pratt and our library system. Know that we have arguably the best library system in the world, shade at New York and everyone else. I just think Enoch Pratt does an outstanding job and really is a place, I think, for a lot of kids who are not sports inclined, but who, why y'all laughing? I'm trying to, I'm trying to be, no, I'm not. I'm just saying children who, would prefer to go find a place to do your homework
I can see the city solicitor smiling down there, and she's smiling because I believe we met shortly after she had broken her leg in a football game.
But the city solicitor, I am going to gander, spend a lot of time both in rec centers and in libraries. So she got a little bit of both, but maybe not as much on this side of the table. But look,
You're talking about an athlete.
No, not you. Not you, sir. Look, the point is that we got to do both. Clearly, there is a real need, especially in this moment where third spaces, places where just anybody can go, whether you're rich or poor, whether it's my daughter going to get her 10 books or whether it's someone who needs a peer navigator to support them with issues dealing with addiction. These are great spaces. And so look forward to that conversation as well. As we know, there are significant capital needs in a lot of our libraries and in Johnston Square and some other places. Going in, and that's really exciting. Just to sort of tack back to where I started, where the mayor started, look, I think this is a moment of economic insecurity for a lot of people and a lot of people in our city. And so, again, where I and I don't want to be publicly clear about this, where I think there is broad agreement is when it comes to fines and fees, if you illegally dump, if you speed, any of these nuisance issues that we are seeking to deter, full support. We have to make sure we are a city that abides by the laws and that holds people fully accountable when they contribute harm to our city, and where I have continued concerns and look forward to a robust conversation as the council receives the budget and we go into agency detail and we're able to go back and forth is on those fines and fees that directly impact Baltimoreans, not those that are breaking the law, not those that are contributing negatively in our communities. And I'm looking forward to the continued conversation with the mayor, with your team, about how we can just support Baltimoreans in this moment of a lot of external pressure, of an administration in Washington, D.C. that is clearly hostile to cities like ours, how we can make sure our folks come out of this whole. So I'm looking forward to that conversation as well.
Yeah, and if I may just respond on the topic of fees in particular, I've been very appreciative of the feedback that you have shared on this recommendation, since we've been discussing the budget over the last couple of weeks. And I just fall back on the best practices that, are established by the Government Finance Officers Association for how local government should look at fees. And they really lean in that, there needs to be a periodic review of the fees that are being collected by the city or by local governments, and looking at those in relation to how much does it cost to provide the service, and what does the benchmarking indicate in terms of what those fees look like in surrounding and peer jurisdictions. And what they really lean into there, and I think what is really sort of a central point of our fee study that my team and I are working on is how do we set these at an appropriate level so that we are not creating an inherent subsidy by having low fees.
Sure.
And so when we have really low fees, or we have fees that haven't been updated for years and years and years, but our costs have grown and grown and grown, what we're doing is we're subsidizing that in a hidden way. And so my goal is that by us completing the fee study and bringing some light to this, we can have a thoughtful conversation about where do we want to set these that is an appropriate level, that is reflective of the type of service that we are providing, and that is tied back to a reasonable rate that should be paid by the end user or whatever the case may be for each individual fee.
No, and I appreciate that and absolutely appreciate the robust dialogue that we've been having about them. I think my question is in part around timing.
Yep.
And having these fees out there without the completion of the study, and really wanting to see that data and understand it. And we had this conversation yesterday when we were talking with Director Senemy about taxes, but really being able to do an apples to apples comparison as we look at all of the revenue sources that Baltimoreans contribute, whether that's taxes, whether that's fees, whether that's fines. I think having a clear data set, having a clear picture will be extremely illuminating. And again, we'll just reiterate that I think this is a moment where folks are really struggling. I know I hear it when I go into the grocery store. Yep. It is not unique to our city, but I think that whether it's the utility bill or fines and fees, that we are seeing a lot of hurt among the people living here. And I think it's incumbent on all of us to be extremely thoughtful in how we address it. And again, I want to thank you because this has been a thoughtful process. I want to thank the mayor and their team because I think there really is a commitment to engage and to listen. I want to thank my colleagues on the council. I want to thank the comptroller, who's just a great partner in all this work, the city administrator, everyone, all the agency folks who are here with us today, who are representing tens of thousands of workers across our city. It's been a really robust process and conversation so far. This is my first time as council president chairing this board, having it, and I've just been really heartened by the commitment to both transparency and also to partnership as we head into what the mayor and I have both agreed will be a challenging budget cycle, given so much of the external pressure that folks are under. Any other questions from the board? Ms. Mayor?
I just want to clear up something about whether this is the athlete side of the board or that is the library side of the board. That was my only question. It seemed that the comptroller was a little confused about which side was which.
Mr. Comptroller.
Why can't we all just get along? You're sitting right next to a woman who clearly has spent more time in the library and on the playing field than either of us. That my whole point was kids need both.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can I make one more reminder before we wrap up?
Yeah, absolutely, Director Larson.
Just want to remind any residents who are watching tonight, just remind folks that this evening, the Board of Estimates will be holding the annual taxpayer night. That event begins at 6 p.m. in this room. Residents can sign up to come give testimony in line or in person, or they can sign up online to give testimony virtually for tonight's hearing.
I appreciate you doing that. That was going to be my closing as well. So you stepped on my line, but that's all right.
I didn't want us to forget.
Nope.
So
Great.
apologies.
Appreciate that. Looking forward to, again, seeing you this evening. As you said, at 6 p.m. for the BOE Taxpayers Night. As Director said, folks can come and testify in person. It also will be online this evening. Again, I just want to thank all of the board and everybody else who contributed to this conversation, and looking forward to this evening. Thank you so much.